What is up, guys? Today we have a very special guest, Godless Cranium, who will be joining us in tackling a video by Zakir Naik.
Hey Stick, thanks for having me on.
Now, if you don't know GC already, he's an atheist skeptic YouTuber who makes great content without losing his cool like I do. I don't know how he does it, but you can find out yourself by clicking the link in the description to go to his channel. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to him. For real though, this guy is pretty fucking awesome, and I highly recommend his channel. Now, without further ado, we are going to be tackling a Zakir Naik presentation that took place over 6 years ago. So sorry if the quality is a bit low or if you can't understand him properly. I had to rewatch a bunch of his video myself just to figure out what he's saying. And no, that doesn't make me a racist.
In the field of oceanology, previously we knew that there was two types of water, salt and sweet. But the Quran says in Surah Furqan, chapter 25, verse number 53, that it is He who has let free two bodies of flowing water, one sweet and palatable, the other salty and bitter. Though they meet, they do not mix. There is a barrier which is forbidden to be trespassed. We knew that there were two types of water, but what does the Quran mean there is a barrier which is forbidden to be trespassed? Today we know that whenever one type of water flows into the other type of water, it loses its constituents and gets homogenized into the water it flows. This homogenizing area is called as a barrier, a barzakh in the Quran. Quran mentioned this 14 years ago.
Predictions or science in the Quran to me just seems like people trying so desperately to convince people their religion that they had to not only reinterpret their holy text in many different ways, but also to cherry pick a bunch of verses that could possibly vaguely represent something we discovered in science once you stretch it enough. But ignoring that, let's take a closer look at the actual verse Naik is quoting. And it is He who released the two seas, one fresh and sweet and one salty and bitter, and He placed between them a barrier and prohibiting partition. Firstly, I guess we should all just ignore how it calls one side sweet and the other bitter. It could have just said fresh and salty and left it at that, because these waters aren't actually sweet nor are they bitter, unless you want to take these terms metaphorically to mean one is better than the other. But judging by how we are supposed to take fresh and salty literally, there's no reason to believe the adjectives right after are metaphors. Second, even if we only consider fresh and salty, it's not always the case in nature where these two types of water don't mix together. In fact, if you pour fresh water on top of salt water or vice versa, it will almost always mix together. Unless, of course, you pour the fresh water in very, very slowly. It might float above the salty water due to density differences. So this verse is wrong in the fact that it's usually not the case that these two water bodies are separated. Third, I have a problem with the word barrier here. There's no physical barrier that would keep two water bodies separate. It is simply the work of physics. Like I mentioned earlier, if you pour fresh water into salt water slowly, it could stay separate, but that is in no way any indication of a barrier of any sort. What kind of barrier are you talking about if it's some barrier that only acts once the substances are introduced slowly? Now, of course, the word barrier could be used in a metaphorical sense here, but if we're going to just reject anything that isn't consistent with science as a metaphor, then what gives the guidelines as to which should be taken literally? This is why I always accuse religious people for cherry picking, because it is the only thing that could really qualify the supposed science in the Quran or Bible as valid. And speaking of which, did I mention how the Bible also mentions the two seas? Acts 27 verse 41, and falling into place where two seas met, they ran the ship around. So by your logic, this means Christianity is true and you're gonna burn in hell like the rest of us.
You know, Professor Stick, it reminds me a bit of horoscopes. They're written vague enough that they tend to be right in some capacity. Then the writer can claim they knew the future. If a holy book had precise predictions or included scientific equations of some sort that couldn't have been known at the time of writing, then I'd be impressed. It might not be enough to convince me that a supernatural God exists, but it would at least give me pause. As it stands, these books are riddled with superstition and bad ideas. They contain nothing that couldn't have been known or guessed at by writers during that time period.
Quran mentioned about biology. It's mentioned in Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 30. وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. We have created every living thing from water. Will you not then believe? Who could have believed in the deserts of Arabia that everything is made from water?
Everyone who is thirsty in the desert? Like, pretty much everyone?
Today science tells us that every living thing is made from water.
Every living organism being created from water is not really true. Water is just a component which does make up a large proportion of the bodies of organisms, but isn't what everything is created from. Now, if the Quran said that carbon created all life, then maybe it has a point there, because at the time of the Quran, carbon wasn't known by men. And since it's something so specific and so essential to life, then I would say that you had a point. But since the Quran says water instead, I'm not very convinced. People could easily figure out the importance of water no matter what time period they're in. Just simply knowing that water is extremely important for survival of living things can make people suspect that organisms are made from water. But science now knows what carbon is. We know that's the main contributor to building life, not water, no matter how important water is.
The Quran also says God made humans from clay and that he simply breathed spirit into them. So which is it? Now, to be fair, this is also often cited as a proof that the Quran is right scientifically speaking. For example, we have this from Miracles of the Quran. When the human body is examined today, it may be discovered that many elements present on the earth are also to be found in the body. Living tissues contain 95% carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, with a total of 26 different elements. Yeah, so imagine that. The elements found on the planet are what constitute the human body. I never would have guessed. Nowhere in that equation do I see a spirit either.
There is a theory known as theory of probability. That if you make a wild guess, the chances you'll be right is depending upon what are the options. For example, if I toss a coin, head or tails, whatever reply you give, the chances you'll be right is 1 upon 2. 50%. Two options, chances you'll be right is 1 upon 2, 50%.
Or you could actually use the scientific method to test whether a coin toss is actually a 50-50 proposition, like Percy Diaconis did. For example, even the 50-50 coin toss really isn't 50-50, it's closer to 51-49, biased towards whatever side was up when the coin was thrown into the air. But more incredibly, as reported by Science News, spinning a penny, in this case one with the Lincoln Memorial on the back, gives even more pronounced odds. The penny will land tail side up roughly 80% of the time. The reason? The side with the Lincoln's head on it is a bit heavier than the flip side, causing the coin's center of mass to lie slightly towards heads. The spinning coin tends to fall towards the heavier side more often, leading to a pronounced number of extra tails results when it finally comes to rest. Science. It works.
If I toss a coin twice, the chances I'll be right both the times is 1 upon 2 into 1 upon 2, it is 1 upon 4, it is 25%. If I toss a coin thrice, the chances I'll be right all 3 times is 1 upon 2 into 1 upon 2 into 1 upon 2, it is 1 upon 8, 12.5%. If I throw a dice, the dice has got 6 sides. The chances if I make a wild guess it will be right is 1 upon 6. Now if you apply this theory of probability, that someone made a wild guess. For example, what is the shape of the earth? You can think of 10 things. Flat, square, rectangle, triangular, hexagonal, on and on, maybe spherical. The chances if you make a wild guess it is spherical, it will be right is 1 upon 10.
Or you can skip the whole guessing thing and actually find evidence for the shape of the Earth.
Not to mention that you're not exactly thinking in the minds of the people in the past. Sure, you could think of plenty of shapes the Earth could be, but no reasonable person would think the Earth is a cube, for example. Even if you had no knowledge of science of any form, a random shape like a cylinder wouldn't exactly cross people's minds. The default shape people would likely resort to would be flat, and that's exactly what we thought for a long time in history. Not to mention that the possibilities you are mentioning here are completely random, and more of an estimation rather than reality. But that's not the main problem I have with your argument here.
If you ask a person, the light of the moon, is it its own light or reflected light? If he makes a wild guess, chances he'll be right is 1 upon 2. The chances that both are right, the shape of the earth and the light of the moon is not its own light, is 1 upon 10 into 1 upon 2 is 1 upon 20. That is 5%. All living creatures, made of what? You can think of 1,000 things. Sand, iron, tin, wood, on and on, maybe even water.
Maybe even water? The Earth is covered with water. Anyone making a guess about what the human body is composed of would be a fool not to guess water, especially since we need to drink water. Something people in the desert would be keenly aware of, to replenish our bodies. And the human body does contain minerals. For example, iron makes up about 0.006% of our chemical composition. Wood is composed of many of the same elements as human beings, including carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and iron.
Chances you make a wild guess and one is right is 1 upon 1,000.
Well, that's just complete speculation, isn't it? I'm pretty sure that there are more than 1,000 types of substances in the universe. But again, who in their right minds would guess sand as a compound that makes up living organisms? Surely these people have seen blood or seen animals getting chopped up. You expect them to just, for some reason, guess sand? And even if all you said were true, that these scientific predictions prove the validity of the Quran, what about the Bible? You know, Christians are also claiming that the Bible has a ton of scientific predictions in its text, so you gotta battle with them too. I'd love to see that.
Chances all three are correct. Shape of the earth is spherical. Light of the moon is reflected. Everything made from water is 1 upon 10 into 1 upon 2 into 1 upon 1000. Is 1 upon 20,000. Is 0.005%. Only in 3 scientific facts, it's 0.005%. I've already mentioned several. And if you read my book, there are hundreds.
Sounds like steep odds, but imagine if you had a many-sided die and you had to guess what number would turn up. You had a 1,000,001 chance of guessing the correct outcome. You're likely to fail, right? But now imagine you could throw that dice for 4 billion years. Again and again and again. It's a fairly safe bet that over the course of 4 billion years, you'll guess the correct number at some point.
This is also an instance of simply cherry-picking the verses that you like and then twisting the meanings of these verses to fit your narrative. Let's look at a few. First, the shape of the earth. The Quran has multiple instances where it mentions or heavily implies that the earth is flat. How ironic, since you literally just brought up the shape of the earth in your presentation. Let's look at chapter 20, verse 53. He who has made for you the earth like a carpet spread out. Or perhaps chapter 71, verse 19. And Allah has made the earth for you as a carpet. Now, I don't know about you, but carpet sounds pretty flat to me, and these aren't the only verses available. Chapter 15, verse 19, chapter 43, verse 10, etc., etc. Let's take a look at some more. Chapter 86, verse 5. Man should reflect on what he was created from. He was created from spurting liquid, proceeding between the backbone and the ribs. Last I checked, semen doesn't come from a space between your backbone and ribs. Rather, it is made from multiple components involving proteins and liquids secreted by your testes, prostate, seminal vesicles, and bulbourethral gland. The Quran doesn't seem all that accurate to me. The point is, there are plenty of verses that could either go against or support scientific discovery. What is not okay is cherry-picking the ones you like and claiming that it proves the validity of your holy book, because it doesn't. You know what would be something you could show us that would actually make the Quran valid? Predict a scientific discovery that has not yet been made. One that we don't know yet, and it has to be something specific. If you can do that, then I will concede.
There are many things. Quran speaks about botany in Surah Ra'd, chapter number 13, verse number 3, that all the fruits are created in pairs, in sexes male and female.
So the Quran leaves out all asexual fruits or plants, depending on how literally you want to take that verse. An example of an asexual fruit would be navel oranges. Bananas are another example. There are also several more examples of asexual plants. In other words, your Quran is wrong once again.
Quran says in Surah Taha, chapter number 20, verse 53, that the plants are made in sexes male and female, which you came to know recently. In the field of zoology, Quran says the animals and the birds live in community like the human beings. In Surah Anam, chapter number 6, verse number 38, which we came to know recently.
Again, it's fairly easy for people to observe the communities that form, such as bees, ants, and especially birds that fly in the skies. It's not that difficult to predict that animals can form communities too. In addition, not all animals have social communities. Just because the Quran mentions something like this and a few species could form social groups, that doesn't mean the verse is correct. Unless, of course, it applied to every single animal species on the planet.
Quran speaks about the bee, that it can find its path, which we came to know recently in Surah Nahl, chapter number 16, verse number 60 and 69. The Quran says that the worker bee, the female bee, previously thought it was the male bee. Quran says in Surah Nahl, chapter number 16, verse number 69, that the worker bee, the female bee. Quran speaks about the lifestyle of the spider in Surah Ankabut, chapter 29, verse number 41. The Quran speaks about the lifestyle of the ant in Surah Namal, chapter number 27, verse number 17 and 18, which we have come to know recently.
Lots of gish galloping going on here. Just spew out verses, talk as fast as you can, and don't give people enough time to actually think about what you're saying. After all, most of them want to believe what you're saying, so they're not going to question too much. If you just speak confidently about the subject, they'll believe you're an authority figure worth listening to.
Quran speaks about genetics, that it is the male fluid, it is the sperm which is responsible for the sex of the child. In Surah Najm, chapter number 53, verse number 45 and 46, as well as chapter number 75, verse number 37 to 39.
I looked up the verses and it doesn't say that. You know what would be impressive though? If the Quran specifically said, Women have XX chromosomes while males have XY. Since each parent only passes one chromosome to the offspring, the sex of the child is determined by the father. That would be amazing. Don't bring us this vague shit and expect us to believe you when you stretch it that far.
Which we came to know recently. Quran speaks about embryology, that all the human beings are made from alaka, a leech-like substance, something which clings.
No. Alaka refers to anything that clings, so it could refer to coagulated blood, which, by the way, isn't what the embryo starts off with. If you twist the meaning a bit more, it could simply refer to the embryo that clings to the wall of the uterus, which also isn't exactly correct since the zygote is more so buried inside it. In addition, even if we do say that alaka refers to the human embryo, it is more so the second stage of embryo development. If you take this apart carefully, you will see that this verse isn't exactly saying what you think it's saying. And even if it does, it's not unreasonable to guess that some coagulated blood is required inside the mother for an embryo to develop.
Quran speaks about the various embryological stages. Alaka, mudga, izama, lahem. In Surah Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 12 to 14.
Ah yes, of course, the Quran predicting the exact developmental stages, you say. Let's take a look at the verse. Then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump of flesh, and we made from the lump bones, and we covered the bones with flesh. Then we developed him into another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators. The verse is implying that the embryo becomes a lump of flesh. This flesh then becomes bone, and the bone is then covered with flesh. Since the original flesh turned into bone, this verse is saying how the flesh we have on our bodies and the final product came after the bones were made, which of course isn't exactly correct. Flesh could refer to a large range of non-bone tissue, in which the undifferentiated cells of the embryo could easily classify as. Therefore, this is wrong. The flesh came first, then the bones. Of course, this would ultimately depend on how you define flesh. In addition, bones are created by the mesoderm. The mesoderm is a type of cell that embryo pluripotent cells differentiate into, and will eventually become muscles, cartilage, blood, epithelia, and of course, bones. Since these various other cells arise at the same time as bones, bones didn't exactly come before flesh. Unless, of course, you don't consider muscles as flesh. In fact, muscles develop faster than bones, since bones aren't even fully formed until months after parturition. In conclusion, this verse is a piece of shit that doesn't get anything right.
Which we have come to recently. There are various scientific facts mentioned in the Quran.
Many of which are completely wrong, as we've pointed out in this video.
I'll just mention two more. There are people who say that after we human beings die, and after we are buried, and our bones are disintegrated, how will Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be able to reconstruct the bone on the day of judgment? So Allah says, it's mentioned in the Quran, chapter number 75, verse number 3 and 4, that when they say that how will Allah be able to reconstruct the bones on the day of judgment, tell them, Allah can not only reconstruct the bones, He can even reconstruct in perfect order the very tips of your fingers.
So when asked a legitimate question, just answer that your magic book says a supernatural being can magically reconstruct your skeletal structure. Very convincing. Just ignore reality and pretend like this being is capable of doing whatever you claim it can do.
What does Allah mean by saying He can not only reconstruct your bones, He can even reconstruct in perfect order the very tips of your fingers? It was in 1880 that Sir Francis Gould, he discovered the fingerprinting method and said that no two fingerprints, even in a million human beings, are identical. Today the police, the CID, the FBI, the CIA, they use the fingerprinting method to identify the criminal. Quran speaks about the fingerprinting method 1400 years ago, and we discovered in 1880.
No. The Quran talks about a being magically reconstructing people from dust. It says nothing about fingerprinting and in no way describes the method of obtaining a fingerprint. You've decided to interpret that primitive story in such a way that it confirms your bias. Now, if the Quran had laid out a guide on fingerprinting, I'd be impressed, even if it had been a simplified guide, such as how to collect latent or patent prints.
Who could have mentioned this? I would like to mention one more thing, before I end the scientific facts, is that there was a scientist by the name of Professor Takrata Kashan. Professor Takrata Kashan hails from Thailand, and he was doing a great deal of research in the pain receptors. Previously, we human beings, we thought, and the doctors thought, that only the brain was responsible for the feeling of pain. Today, we come to know that there are certain receptors in the skin, which are also responsible for the feeling of pain. That's the reason when a person of burn injury comes to a doctor, the doctor takes a pin and pricks it in the area of burn. If the patient feels pain, the doctor is happy. The pain receptors are intact. If the patient does not feel pain, the doctor is sad. The pain receptors have been destroyed. It's mentioned in the Quran, in Surah Nisa, chapter number 4.
Before we get into that, I just want to point out that without your brain, you have no way of interpreting what those pain receptors are telling you. You would feel no pain without your brain. Your brain is responsible for interpreting the signals coming from your pain receptors. If you damage those receptors, they're no longer able to send signals to your brain. That's why you don't feel the pain.
The interesting part is that this guy trained as a physician before he became a speaker. I worry for our education system if a trained physician doesn't know what a nociceptor is. Or maybe he does know, but chose to mislead the public in an attempt to prove the validity of the Quran.
Verse 56, that as to those who reject our signs, we shall cast them in the hellfire, and as often as the skins are roasted, we shall give them fresh skin so that they feel the pain. Indicating there is something in the skin which is responsible for the feeling of pain. Imagine, Quran speaks about the pain receptors 1400 years ago.
Yes, in the most barbaric way possible. Not in a scientific way, but in how best to torture someone for eternity with fire. What a gross book. Unbelievable that so many people buy this horse shit.
And Professor Tagha Dagashan, when he came to know this is mentioned in the Quran, in the 9th Medical Conference in Riyadh, in the conference itself, he said the Shahada and said, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. There is no God but Allah, and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon the Messenger of Allah. So when you ask the atheist, who could have mentioned this in the Quran? The only reply I can give you is the same which he gave you earlier. It is the creator, it is the maker, it is the producer, it is the manufacturer, it is the inventor. This creator, this producer, this manufacturer, this maker, this inventor, we Muslims call him as Allah.
Well, I call him superstitious horse shittery. We've also shown that the, quote, scientific claims found in your book are often wrong. They aren't scientific claims at all. They're stories, and bad ones at that. You've just chosen to latch on to anything that even remotely resembles a scientific claim, and use that to reinforce your belief in the supernatural.
I would love to see him address the so-called scientific claims made in the Bible. The thing that would please me the most right now is a debate between a Christian and a Muslim.
That's the reason today science is not eliminating God. It is eliminating models of God. La ilaha illallah.
The f***? Explain to me the difference, please. Actually, I'll do that. When we attempt to describe the reality of the universe, we create models with predictive capabilities, and that's what science is really about, creating models that can tell us something. Which means whenever we discover something about the universe, it's essentially a model. We use it in a pretty vague way here, so if we're disproving models of God, we're just disproving God. Enough said.
Scientists today, they're eliminating models of God. This cannot be God, this cannot be God. They aren't eliminating God.
No, what we observe using the scientific method at times contradicts what believers say God is or what it has done. Those findings contradict your holy books. But like this video shows, believers just reinterpret those books to fit within what we can observe to be true. Either that or they just claim that their God is outside of understanding or can defy the laws of physics at will. They essentially make their God unfalsifiable. Anyone can play that game. Competing religions can do the same thing.
And a famous philosopher and scientist, Francis Bacon, he said that those who have little knowledge of science, they become atheists. But those who have in-depth knowledge of science, they become a believer in God. I would like to end my talk with the quotation of the Quran from Surah Fussilat, chapter 41, verse number 53, which says, سَنُورِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِ بِرَبِّكَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٌ. That soon we shall show them our signs.
Well, this appears to be the end of the video. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Godless Cranium for this awesome collaboration. Please check out his channel, which will be in the description. I highly recommend him and you won't regret it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you next week.